G'day, Professor Joseph Drew. Yet another instalment on the special rate variation or taxation increase series of videos. Now this applies to obviously councils in New South Wales and Victoria where they have special rate variations, but it also applies to local governments throughout the nation. You've all got to have a taxation policy. You've all got to vary your taxes from time to time. And the same sort of ideas are relevant to what you're doing. In this video, I'm looking at the moral considerations of an SRB. This is what the councillors worry about the most, with good reason, but I don't think they always understand how many moral stakeholders are involved. So let me explain. Now, clearly they know that there's a stakeholder group, these guys here, who are the ratepayers, the people who will be directly affected by the increase in local government taxation. I think they're very aware of that group. They're usually that group themselves. There's another group of stakeholders that I often think is extremely important. Renters. They tend to be people on low incomes, people doing it more tough. Now, the question is, are they directly affected by local government rate increases? And the answer is no. Usually they are on rental contracts. Their landlord has no capacity to pass on the increase in their rates for quite some time. Furthermore, the landlord deducts their rates as a tax deduction, so they have no right to pass on more than a proportion of the increase in taxes. So I think a lot of local government councillors worry a lot about renters, and they are vulnerable people in our society. I'm not saying it's wrong to worry about them, but I don't think they always acknowledge that the renters will be unaffected for quite some time because of the rental contract, and moreover, that they will only ever see part of the increase because the landlord will be exporting part of that increase to the federal government as a tax deduction. There's two groups that I think our councillors don't tend to notice as much. I'm sure they're cognizant of it, but I think it would be good if you were focusing a lot more on these two groups. The first group of moral stakeholders that seem to get neglected are future taxpayers and residents. Now, the definition of financial sustainability is for you to meet the need of the current generation of taxpayers and residents without impinging on the capacity of future taxpayers and residents to meet their own needs. Now, when you take out debt or you run down asset quality, have successive deficits when you're not financially sustainable, and you don't react by making a sacrifice such as putting up taxes, you do impinge on that group of stakeholders very much. When you take on debt and you rack up deficits and implicit debts and explicit debts, you are telling this group of future taxpayers that part of their taxes are already taken up by delivering the things that you could have delivered during your time as a councillor, as your time as a ratepayer. So you're pre-spending some of their taxes. Now, this is indeed the most vulnerable group, more vulnerable than the socio-demographically vulnerable people. Because you know what? They have no voice. They're your children, your grandchildren. They're people that might immigrate to Australia in the future, or people that might internally immigrate from another local government area. They have no voice and they're not really aware of what you're doing. I think they deserve considerable attention and they deserve your wise consideration because they are so vulnerable to local governments who don't look after their financial sustainability, who don't generate enough taxes to ensure that they are sustainable, that they're making those sacrifices to pay off the implicit and explicit debts. The other group that don't get noticed as much as we might like to or ought to be noticing are staff. staff are very vulnerable in a financially unsustainable local government. Senior staff, of course, if the minister decides you're so financially unsustainable that they sack the council, they will also almost certainly ditch the general manager and the CFO. They tend to be early victims. There will then be staff layoffs. This is what's happened in other periods of financial administration. And lots of those staffs will have their careers and their incomes abruptly interrupted. And they deserve our moral consideration too. So I guess my point here is that all the focus is on current ratepayers. And I think it might be fair to say there's even more focus on these vulnerable people who tend to be renters. And we neglect the future ratepayers that deserve our attention, our moral consideration every bit as much. And the staff who are there right in front of us, who stand to lose more than most of us if things do go awry. Okay, so is it morally acceptable to increase taxes? It depends which stakeholder group you're talking about. If you're talking about that first group of stakeholders, the ratepayers, well, is it a good time to increase taxes? No, it isn't. Is it morally reasonable for them to pay for their current expenditure? Of course it is. It's not morally reasonable for them to defer that on to another generation that can't even speak for themselves. Will people accept good reasons and be reasonable? Yes, they will. I've proved that many times. It's how you present it. What about that next group of stakeholders, the vulnerable people who tend to be renters? Is it morally acceptable to increase their taxes? Well, the point is you're not. You're increasing the taxes of their landlords, and they can't pass on that increase for some time. It might be many years. Moreover, they're not justified in passing on the whole tax increase anyway, because they will export that increase as a deduction in their federal government taxes. So the people that we tend to worry about most are probably the safest people from the effects. Then we have that group of people that we just entirely forget about, those future taxpayers. Is it morally acceptable to increase taxes now? Well, actually, morally, we must increase taxes. It's not acceptable to bury our heads in the sand and continue being financially unsustainable and continuing to rack up implicit and explicit debts that they will have to pay that might be such a burden that they may not even be able to meet their own needs in the future. That's not morally acceptable. And what about the staff? They tend to be ratepayers as well, but they're also income earners. They depend on the council for their job. And lots of people, like other people, particularly that vulnerable group, they depend on the council for services. And they don't want to see these services slashed by an administrator that comes in with a razor. So is it morally acceptable to increase taxes for them? Yes. So you can see that when we look at each stakeholder group, and we start thinking about those two groups that get neglected, and thinking about that vulnerable group as their reality actually is, rather than just a mere conception of their vulnerability, when we realize that they generally can't be affected straight away, and they won't receive the whole effect of the increase of taxes, the moral evaluation changes quite considerably. Now, people will say to me that it's a high inflation environment, people are doing it really tough. Well, they are. It is never a good time to increase the taxes. And for a lot of you councils, if you don't increase the taxes, and administrators coming in the next year or two anyway, and who says the time's going to be any better? I don't think it will be. I think we're moving into a period of high inflation, low growth or negative growth or stagflation, which is even more miserable than what we've been in the last couple of years. Who's to say that if you don't do the thing that is necessary now, which is increase taxes, that the time in the future when they will have to go up, when the administrator just walks in and has all power and will just put them up whether the people like it or not, that time's going to be any better? The chances are it won't be any better. There is never a good time. But inflation is moving up, and it's going to move up a lot higher yet. It'll be up well over 5% by the end of the year. It could get into double digits. It's quite likely. Now, it's not a good time, but everything is going up. Your cost for a local government are going up considerably. Concrete up 20%, steel up 30%. People's expectations, consumer expectations about inflation are actually quite high. People expect high inflation, well over 5%. It's not going to be a shock to them when their rates do go up 5% or more. That's what they're expecting. It'll probably be more of a shock to them if you just pop it up by the 0.7% rate cap. So it's not a good time. No, it's not. Can people cope? Hopefully your most vulnerable people won't have to cope with it for some time, if at all. But it is a necessity whether you like it or not. And this is the key moral dilemma. We don't want to do it. No one wants to put up rates. I don't want to recommend that rates go up. But what's the alternative? You let the council go belly up. People who rely on those services don't have it. People that rely on the council for a job don't have it. Administrator comes in and bumps them up by double digits like we've seen elsewhere in states, in the state of New South Wales. And the thing you sought to avoid happened anyway. How are those things any better? Where's the better alternative? Now, please bear in mind that I never propose we just talk about putting rates up. We always negotiate it with a community. We look at savings that councils can make, but most councils don't have much fat. We look at structural changes that could save money. We look at alternatives, such as pricing our goods and services that have fees associated with them more carefully according to supply side methodology. But ultimately, usually we are faced with the need for a taxation increase, particularly in a high inflation environment where the rate cap is not keeping up with inflation, which means in real terms we're going backwards by 2 or 3% when so many councils are in a perilous position already. The reality is usually taxes are unavoidable, but it will be a combination of cost cutting, of working smarter, of getting the fees and charges right, of advocating for a fairer deal with financial assistance grants, which is something I'm very keen on, but also inevitably tax increases. There's never a silver bullet, and none of the medicine is ever nice. Otherwise, people would have done it some time ago and you wouldn't be faced with the dilemma that you're faced with at present. Look, it's a very difficult issue dealing with the moral question of tax increases. It's not nice. It's never going to be nice. All I've sought to do in this video is to get you to think about all the stakeholders carefully and to recognize what reality is for a lot of those stakeholders. It's often not what you think. Now, what's got to be done has got to be done, and it's just part of life, unfortunately, being an adult. If you've got any questions, please get in contact with me. If I can help in any way, you've only got to ask the question and I'll answer it in a video. I thank you very much for your time. Goodbye.